Video game localization is the process of adapting a specific game to better match the needs, conventions, and ideals of cultures other than that of the said game's nation of origin.
Me when I reuse part of a previous video because I'm lazy?
Proper localization of media is great for the consumer because it means that they can enjoy games, movies, and books from countries all over the world. And it's great for companies because the more places their products are available, the more people are able to spend money on those products. For those of you who don't know, most companies really like money. The video game industry in particular is intrinsically and inescapably linked to localization. A significant portion of the world's most popular games and consoles come from Japan. And in the early days of the industry, they were almost exclusively coming from Japan. International localization was a necessity, and before long, it had become the norm. A norm that has continued to this day. And now, developers all over the world are localizing their games to any country that'll take them. And it's great, but it hasn't always been this great. Because even when Japan was the only country consistently exporting the majority of their games, not every game managed to get localized. So today, we will be discussing video games that never made their way out of Japan. Until they finally did. A recent example of a Japan-only game making its way to the West is the recently released Like a Dragon Inshin. Fun fact! This video was actually supposed to come out on February 25th, 2023, but I'm a lazy bitch. The Yakuza franchise is a series that I have already spoken about on several occasions in videos of varying quality. But for those of you who don't already know, Yakuza is a series of Japanese crime dramas about big, sexy, muscular mafia men absolutely going to town on one another. And no, I can't think of a better way to phrase that. The main story of each game takes itself very seriously, but the games themselves absolutely refuse to do the same. Sure, you can rough up some thugs, solve some mysteries, watch your favorite character have his eye carved out, get falsely accused of murder, and rise to the top of the criminal underworld. But you can also sing karaoke, dance at a disco, fight men in diapers, and put way too much faith in a chicken. It's a very serious franchise that absolutely refuses to take itself seriously, and it might just be my favorite video game series of all time. Which is why I am so lucky that with the exception of 4 spin-off titles, every single Yakuza game was released worldwide alongside their Japanese counterparts. The first 2 Japanese exclusive games, Black Panther Like a Dragon and its sequel, are a pair of Yakuza spin-off games taking place outside the mainline story and featuring an original main character. These games were never localized in any form and are therefore not important to this video. What is important to this video are the other 2 Japanese exclusive spin-offs. Ryu ga Gotoku Kenzan and Ryu ga Gotoku Inshin are a pair of Yakuza spin-offs released on the PlayStation 3 exclusively in Japan. The 2 games are technically unrelated in terms of story and characters, but are often paired together due to the shared themes and settings that set them apart from the rest of the franchise. These 2 games take place in Edo-era Japan and are fictionalized retellings of believed historical events from that time period. They feature many of the major characters of the mainline Yakuza franchise taking on the roles of major historical figures from the Edo period, with series main character Kiryu Kazuma taking on the roles of Miyamoto Musashi in Kenzan and Sakamoto Ryoma in Inshin, as well as several other series staples taking on the roles of prominent figures from the characters' stories. As an American, none of these names really mean anything to me, but I still think it's a really cool idea. Anyway, for many years, both of these games remained exclusive to Japan, likely due to their heavy emphasis on Japanese history being viewed as potentially uninteresting to international audiences, and the genre changed from crime dramas to samurai period pieces being viewed as potentially alienating to fans of the mainline games. However, Ryu ga Gotoku Inshin did eventually receive an international release earlier this year, with its remake Like a Dragon Inshin. Kenzan, on the other hand, has yet to receive any sort of remake or international release, but with the critical and commercial success of both Like a Dragon Inshin and also the Yakuza series as a whole, it wouldn't be insane to hope for a Western release of Ryu ga Gotoku Kenzan. Either way, I'm just happy to finally be able to play Inshin. Now, we can't really talk about Japan-exclusive games that eventually came to America without the most famous example, Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels. Now, I've already talked about this situation in depth in a previous video, and we've all heard this story a million times, so I'm gonna try to do this as quickly as possible. Basically, the story of Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels can be boiled down to blah 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 Mario, blah 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 Nintendo, blah 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 America, and blah 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 Doki Doki Literature Club. The original Super Mario Bros. Was released in 1985 on the NES, where it quickly found unprecedented critical and commercial success. It was the best-selling game of all time for years, and it arguably saved the video game industry in America. Wanting to capitalize on the first game's massive success, Nintendo developed and released a sequel. Super Mario Bros. 2 found massive success in Japan, but when they sent the game over to America, Nintendo of America decided that the game was simply too difficult and too similar to the first game to do well outside of Japan. Spoiler alert, they were right. Rather than release a game that they knew would fail, Nintendo of America grabbed Doki Doki Panic, a similar game that was already going through the localization process, slapped a big ol' Mario on the cover, and released the game as Super Mario Bros. 2. And the rest is history. The American version of Super Mario Bros. 2 eventually made its way to Japan under the name of Super Mario Bros. USA, and the Japanese version of Super Mario Bros. 2 finally came to America under the name of Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels as a part of Super Mario All-Stars, a 4-game compilation cartridge containing all 4 existing Super Mario Bros. Games that was released on the Super Nintendo in 1994. So both versions of Super Mario Bros. 2 are available in all regions, and we all get to decide which version we prefer. Personally, I am a much bigger fan of the North American release of Super Mario Bros. 2, but I am also a pretty big fan of sniffing glue and eating paint, so maybe don't take my word as law. Ace Attorney is a series of legal drama visual novels developed by Capcom. They feature a lawyer by the name of Wright and tell the story of his adventures across the many cases he won and investigations he participated in. Can you believe that the company that made Mega Man and Street Fighter also made a game about that shit from Better Call Saul? What a novel idea! Now, technically, most of the games in the Ace Attorney series were initially released exclusively in Japan, before later being released worldwide, because translating 80 billion lines of text takes time. But of the 11 games that make up the Ace Attorney franchise, only about half were released with the intention of being Japanese exclusives. These games were the original Wright trilogy on the Game Boy Advance, the Great Ace Attorney Duology, and Ace Attorney Investigations 2, which we will not be discussing because it is the only Ace Attorney game to never make its way outside of Japan. Anyway, the first 3 games in the Ace Attorney series were originally released on the Game Boy Advance exclusively in Japan before receiving enhanced ports on the Nintendo DS. These re-releases ended up getting released in all regions and marked the first ever time that an Ace Attorney game was released outside of Japan. But technically, they were never supposed to be. Okay. Bear with me for a second. When developing the re-release of the original Ace Attorney game, the localization team added a whole slew of quality of life improvements, support for the Nintendo DS's built-in microphone, a never-before-seen 5th chapter, and an English language option. Now, one would assume that the inclusion of an English translation in a Japanese video game would be the result of a North American and European localization process, but in actuality, this re-release was initially meant to be a Japanese exclusive with the English translation designed to be a major selling point in Japan. Now, for those of you who don't know, the primary language in Japan is Japanese, not English. Even with the language becoming more and more popular in Japan, the vast majority of Japanese natives do not speak English. And even the ones who do still prefer to almost exclusively communicate and consume media in Japanese. So what the fuck? Anyway, since the English translation already existed, Capcom ended up releasing the game in all English-speaking territories where it found impressive critical and commercial success. Capcom then went on to translate the other two re-releases as well as the vast majority of subsequent Ace Attorney games and release them internationally, where they have continued to find critical and commercial success to this day.
Now, I know that this story sounds way too crazy to be true, and seeing as my only source is Wikipedia, it probably is. But I think that the world would be a far more interesting place if we all just assume that this story is true and ask no further questions.
Moving on, the Great Ace Attorney Adventures and the Great Ace Attorney 2 Resolve are a duology of Ace Attorney spin-offs released in 2015 and 2017 respectively. The games take place at some point between the late 19th and early 20th century and prominently feature the courtroom dynamics of Meiji period Japan and Victorian era England. The Great Ace Attorney Adventures was my introduction to the Ace Attorney series, and the Great Ace Attorney games are my favorite of the series. The duology features some unique twists on the series' traditional courtroom and investigation gameplay, and the Meiji and Victorian era setting offers a fun alternative to the series' traditionally modern setting. The two games were originally released on the 3DS as Japanese exclusives and would not make their way to international audiences until the release of the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles, a remastered compilation of both games released on the Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 4, and PC in summer of 2021. It has never been publicly stated why exactly these two games were exclusive to Japan for so long. Even after the games' director publicly stated that he has always wanted them to receive a worldwide release. But there are two possibilities that seem to be the most widely accepted within the gaming community. The first is that much like with Like a Dragon Inshin, the games were simply deemed to be too steeped in Japanese culture to appeal to international audiences, and that the games' historical setting would make it difficult for fans to relate to and understand the game's stories and characters. What this theory fails to recognize is that Ace Attorney fans are insane and will consume literally any piece of media that even remotely relates to the Ace Attorney series, that Japanese media is rapidly becoming insanely popular outside of Japan, that the historical setting is actually really cool, and that regardless of time period and setting, Capcom is gonna have trouble marketing this game to American audiences specifically, not because the game is too Japanese or European, but because it's a visual novel and Americans are illiterate. The other and far more likely theory is that Capcom feared legal action for the game's unlicensed use of Sherlock Holmes, a character who has been the subject of several intense legal battles despite being fully and unequivocally in the public domain. Now, this theory holds a little extra weight due to the fact that the Great Ace Attorney's parody of Sherlock Holmes has had his name changed to Herlock Sholmes in the game's 2021 re-release. Regardless of whatever reason we had to wait, the games have finally made their way outside of Japan, and that's all that matters to me. Also, this has nothing to do with the rest of the video, but I just wanted to say that Herlock Sholmes is perhaps the gayest character ever, and that he stands alongside the game's Gina Lestrade as one of my favorite characters of all time. I just love them both so much! And speaking of Japan exclusive visual novels released in America in 2021, the Famicom Detective Club is a pair of murder mystery visual novels developed and published by Nintendo and initially released exclusively on the Japanese Famicom. Yeah, who could have guessed that one? Where they found positive reception from fans and critics alike. Even after receiving a remake on the Super Famicom and a re-release on the Game Boy Advance, the two games never found their way outside of Japan. Now, this was back when video game localization was still in its infancy, so the amount of time, money, and effort necessary to translate the wall of text that is the average visual novel likely didn't appear to be a good investment to Nintendo. Either that, or they just rightfully assumed that Americans don't know how to read. Anyway, as time went on and the industry continued to mature and the world got smaller and smaller and visual novels grew more and more popular outside of Japan and the localization process became easier and more efficient, video game companies felt more and more comfortable releasing their text walls outside of Japan. And in 2021, top-to-bottom remakes of both Famicom Detective Club games were released worldwide on the Nintendo Switch to, radio silence, I guess. Nobody really talks about these games, and I couldn't find any concrete sales numbers, but they did manage to sell about 20,000 copies in Japan, so that's something, I guess. Honestly, I don't really care. All I know is that I didn't buy these games, and neither did any of you. And that's what makes us American. Not knowing how to read. Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest are two long-running turn-based RPG franchises developed by Japanese companies Squaresoft and the Enix Corporation, respectively. The two franchises have a lot in common. They're both turn-based RPGs with a heavy emphasis on storytelling, they both got their start on the NES, they both found massive commercial success in Japan but initially failed to find their footing overseas. Now that Squaresoft and the Enix Corporation have merged into Square Enix, they're both owned by the same company, and they have some of the dumbest and most needlessly complicated localization stories in video game history. Starting with Dragon Quest, the first 4 games in the Dragon Quest franchise were released on the Japanese Famicom before eventually being released to the NES under the title of Dragon Warrior because Dragon Quest was already taken and copyright laws are fucking stupid. Anyway, the 4 games found massive success in Japan, but when released overseas, they failed to find a consistent audience. The sales of the Dragon Warrior franchise, as well as most of Enix's other international releases, were simply too low to justify the continued localization of Enix's games, and the company closed its American branch and discontinued the sales of their games outside of Japan. At least, until the release of Final Fantasy VII, which we will talk about later, led to a massive increase in the popularity of RPGs outside of Japan, and Enix decided to take another crack at releasing their games internationally with the release of Dragon Quest VII on the PlayStation 1. It was with this release that the Dragon Quest franchise finally found its footing outside of Japan, and not long after, it finally got released in regions other than just Japan and North America. And ever since then, every single mainline Dragon Quest game, with the exception of Dragon Quest X, has been released in every region and under the original series name. Meanwhile, Enix's main competitor Squaresoft produced and released 6 titles in the Final Fantasy series. Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 3 released on the Japanese Famicom, and Final Fantasy 4, 5, and 6 released on the Japanese Super Famicom. Unlike Enix, Squaresoft never had the good sense to stop releasing their games overseas, but much like Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy only managed to localize 3 games prior to the release of the PlayStation 1. And you'll never guess which 3 games it was. Logic would dictate that Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 3 would be the games that made it outside of Japan, and just looking at the North American Final Fantasy cartridges would certainly lead you to that conclusion. But guess what? 1, 4, 6. Go fuck yourself, Squaresoft. Yeah. So, for various reasons, including but not limited to long localization time, poorly aging graphics, the release of the Super Nintendo, and the high cost of localization, Squaresoft kind of skipped around a bit while deciding which of their games would get released outside of Japan. And they altered their numbering system to keep North American fans from getting confused. The altered numbering system actually does make quite a bit of sense in theory, and it worked perfectly up until Final Fantasy VII released worldwide with its original number intact. How did we get here? And with Final Fantasy VII finding the most overseas success of any Japanese RPG up to that point, Squaresoft was finally justified in releasing every future mainline Final Fantasy game, and more than a few spin-off titles, worldwide. It did take a few years, but every Japanese exclusive mainline Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest game did eventually find their way to Western audiences. The Japanese exclusive Final Fantasy games mainly did this in the form of compilation discs on the PS1 and digital-only releases on modern eShops, while the Japanese exclusive Dragon Quest games found their way to America in the form of top-to-bottom remakes on the Nintendo DS. So no matter where they live, anyone has the ability to slog through the 40 million hours necessary to play these games. But to the poor soul that takes on the Herculean task of playing through the entire Final Fantasy series in order, good luck deciphering Squaresoft's dipshit riddle. There really isn't much more that I would like to say on the matter, other than at every step of the process, all of the worst possible decisions were made. Every single time there was an opportunity to do something stupid was done.
But hey, that's Square Enix, baby. On that positive note, this is the end of the video. I kind of suck at outros, so I just want to say thanks for watching? Oh, and to anybody currently living outside of Japan, have fun watching this video when it finally gets localized in 10 years.